Extremism and progress. Now let's start with the Roman Empire as an example. Now the Roman Empire started as a republic with the plebeians and the patricians. When it first started, it was more of a town, a trading town that was a group of loosely associated individuals, like many countries that start, who had a common goal of founding themselves in this town, and they eventually called it Rome. I'm not exactly sure when. But as time progressed, people started to see the corruption in the Republic, and eventually people's passion was for a strong leader that would basically stem the tide of corruption and lead them into a glorious new future. And, it's arguable whether it's the people that caused Rome to become an empire and basically have emperors until it's up to its collapse. But that's what happened. It became an empire, it had emperors, and eventually it collapsed. But we see these two extremes, a republic and basically kind of a tyranny, but also you can call it a empire, a monarchy, very similar to a monarchy at least, and somebody with a country with a very strong leader that can make very big decisions. So we have a republic, and the pendulum swings back and forth between these extremes. So that's one swing. And eventually, after the empire fell, the country that became Italy eventually stabilized a little bit more. But it took some big swings in that pendulum from one extreme to the other, republic to empire. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to when France had, and this is obviously a different country, when France had a monarchy. And during the French Revolution, which eventually ended in Napoleon being crowned emperor, everyone was tired of the monarchy. They were tired of being treated like peasants. They were tired of being treated like lesser. They were tired of the opulence of the monarchy and the nobles, the ruling class. So the people essentially rose up and went to. So we start off with the monarchy, very, very, individual based. Few people had a lot of power, basic say in everything, and nobody else could really do anything about it in France. And then everyone got tired of that. So all the nobles and king and queen executed. We go from the monarchy, the pendulum swings. We go to a very nationalistic state. Jacobin Revolution was very vengeful in taking back the power to the people, and it was very people-based, peasant-up based. From monarchy came a desire to provide for the people and to have a government ruled by the people. And the pendulum swung to the extreme other side of the spectrum. And this resulted in a lot of people being killed, but a lot of people were killed under the monarchy as well when they were in power. This resulted in quite a few people being killed just because they didn't agree with the extreme nature of the Jacobin Revolution, and I'm probably saying that incorrectly. But it basically swung to an extreme that could be summarized as very nationalistic and the beginnings of socialism, you could say. And not necessarily democratic socialism, because there wasn't a complete democracy or a democracy that really took into account everyone's vote. That wasn't something that came with the blooming socialism. It was more of a system they were testing out, and they didn't really know how to get everybody's vote. It wasn't an idea yet, so they had this revolution that swung the pendulum, but they didn't really know how to carry it out completely. But eventually, when the pendulum came back, Napoleon was a very charismatic leader. He had a vision for the future of France, and we start to see it come back to the pendulum come back to the middle. But eventually, when Napoleon had complete power, it went back up to a basic monarchy where he had all the power, and an emperor is very similar to a monarch. So Napoleon basically gained the power and swung the pendulum back without anybody really knowing that he would do this at the time. There was just a strong leader that everybody could follow, that the military could get behind, that would lead them into battle and basically free everyone from the monarchies that pervaded Europe in that day. And despite that that wish, Napoleon ended up being more like a monarch than a real champion of the people, I guess you could say. Many emperors and monarchs started out as champions of the people, we have to remember. But Napoleon, many times in his campaigns, he left large amounts of troops where he evacuated, and he didn't know how to get his troops out, so he just left them. And he sacrificed large numbers of troops. He conscripted many through, I guess you could say, early socialistic propaganda and doctrine. Every old man should be taken to the square and talk about the freedom of France and how it's going to free everybody else. Every woman should weave and do things to support the army. Every man of fighting age, between the ages of, I don't know, mid-teens to almost elderly, should sign up for the army and go free other countries. And this isn't something that even the monarchy did. This wasn't a realistic purpose for the population of France. Now, it wasn't like every person had to do this, but so many people were expected to do these things that it was as if the monarchy had come back and been far worse under new branding, under a new name. And that revolution kind of ended with a new monarch under a different name, like I said. But let's go ahead and fast forward to, let's go to Russia. In Russia, obviously the same thing was happening much later, of course. Well, the monarchs were in charge for a long time, the czars, but the Russian Revolution that became the Soviet Union, we see that the people were tired of the monarchs. I believe the ones who supported and were loyal to the monarchs, the czars, I think they were called the white shirts, I believe. But regardless of what they were called, there were many people that were loyal to them. And when communism basically came into the minds of the Russians through people like Lenin and Stalin, who worked together, from Karl Marx, who was German, many people tossed aside Christian orthodoxy, that was the main religion at the time, and decided to take up the strength and the will of the people, the good of the whole over the individual, the power theoretically to the whole over the power of an individual. And the Soviet Union was basically formed, in early 1900s. The revolution started a little bit before then, I believe. Some of these dates I might be getting mixed up, but I'm trying to give you a general idea of what I'm talking about, not necessarily educate you on the exact dates in history. But when Lenin, when Lenin first had power, he actually made capitalism a thing. He allowed peasants to basically sell their food to get money for it, and then the free market was spread in similar ways in Russia, in the starting years of when the Soviet Union kind of first formed. And but eventually Lenin got sick and died, and even close to his deathbed, he's like, Stalin is too brutal, far too brutal. And when Stalin gained power, he basically executed everyone in the political conference of basically the Bolsheviks, the communists, that had attended. Any political rivals that could even seem like a threat, he had executed. And he became completely in charge of Russia, the Soviet Union. And he basically was a czar or a monarch. And he did worse things than even the monarchs did and the czars did. He basically went to war with the peasantry by saying, okay, he wanted to take all of their crop. He wanted to take everything they produced and provide for people in the city, as if the peasants didn't matter at all and they would basically starve. So that's declaring war. They don't have anything to eat, so they basically have to go to war in order to keep some food for them to eat. I believe it was around 15 to 20 million of his own people were killed in this kind of purge of the peasantry who rose up against him, whether it be from starvation or whether it be from the Bolsheviks fighting back against the ones who wouldn't give up all their food. But he became a very, very terrible person that could be said to be very similar to a monarch, the worst of monarchs. And we see the pendulum swing from monarchy back to, in Russia's case, kind of Bolshevikism, communism. But then as it swings back, Lenin kind of brings some stability. But then it kind of swings back to Stalin being more like a monarch or an emperor or a tyrant. And the extreme goes back just from the force of the pendulum. And now I keep on referring to the pendulum. And obviously all of these governments and countries under tyrannical rule eventually collapsed or weakened to a point where they were no longer effective on the world stage for a time. But the pendulum that I'm referring to is kind of a theory by Hegel's. It's called Hegelian Dialectics. And it's the idea that the pendulum swings from one extreme to the other in human society and human civilization, and then it eventually slows down and kind of rests in the middle. And that's kind of how we progress. One extreme to the other, and it slowly goes down to the middle. Now, Hegel said something else that was very interesting. He said that little can be achieved by mere goodness in the face of the power of nature. Or at least that's very similar to the quote that he had. Or maybe in the presence of the power of nature, something like that. But his point was that the power of nature, the power to dominate, is so fierce that the idea of virtue and goodness can't succeed on its own. There has to be a show of power to balance out nature. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this quote, but it kind of adds to the pendulum theory. And the pendulum theory, I very much agree with that. It kind of swings from one extreme to the other when people get impassioned about their ruling class being the wrong kind of rule. They go to the other extreme, and then eventually goes back to that extreme, then slowly comes down to a moderated middle resting place. And it varies on country as far as how long this middle takes to get to, and what kind of extremes the pendulum goes to. But this pendulum kind of exists in every country, and I found it very interesting. It's once again called Hegelian Dialectics. And I would highly recommend looking up Hegel's The Philosopher, and just taking a look at this, because it really affects human history in an incredible way. His understanding of it, rather, really sums it up. Now, talking about extremism, we see a lot of extremists nowadays. We see religious extremists, political extremists, this and that extremists. This kind of extremism has always existed, political and religious. But it never ends well when violence is a part of your method. When violence, hatred, anger, passion to beat the enemy and be strong in your group, that never ends well in human civilization. And it's bound to happen again and again, and it has, as I've explained. But we have to learn to come together without anger, without passion, and try to work out a moderate solution to what everyone wants. A moderate solution to what we as human beings are most peaceful in. And peace shouldn't be forced, but it should be sought willingly. And the kind of peace that tyrants enforce is not peace. It's only peace for them and terror for everyone else. So we have to remember we can't have a tyrant, and we also can't have a purely nationalistic champion of the people who just wants to go out for our nation. For every tyrant that there is that is nationalistic, there's a state under them that has suffered. We have to basically elect and have leaders that are interested in humanity as a whole. Not just one country, not just one idea, but coming together and figuring out how to exist on this planet as separate countries and as countries united in order for peace and civilization to progress. Extremism only leads to progression when it is defeated and we learn. So let's stop forgetting the lessons of the past and start learning what we can from the very nature of humanity. And that is, we tend to be extreme when passionate and angry, and we can find peace when we start to learn from the lessons that history has taught us, our history. And we can look at recent history or far back history, but we have to examine it closely and individually and imagine a future where we don't need to be extreme and everyone has an equal stake in society, but also is free to act as they please as long as it doesn't hurt someone else and as long as it doesn't hoard resources, in my opinion. But this has just been kind of a discourse on what I think about Hegelian dialectics, extremism and progress, if you will, as I'm going to title this video. But, you know, what are your thoughts? Feel free to share them down in the comment section below. If you like this video or you found any of it interesting, hit that thumbs up down there, give me a like. I love those. And what have you learned from history? What can you learn from your own history?